Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm Alex Bolfras, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control at the IISS office in Berlin, Germany. It's my pleasure to serve as today's moderator in introducing the research paper, Tracking the Components of Missiles and UAVs Used by Russia in Ukraine, What Lessons for Control Regimes? This paper is published by the IISS Missile Dialogue Initiative, which was established in 2019 with the support of the German Federal Foreign Office. In addition to hosting a series of Track 1.5 events on missile technologies and their implications for international security, MDI publishes timely and policy-relevant research on these topics. And the report we're discussing today is an excellent addition to the MDI research catalog. It does two things. First, it examines the technological makeup of Russian, Iranian, and North Korean missile and UAV debris that has been found in Ukraine since 2022. It also traces the international procurement routes of foreign components found in those missiles and UAVs. This is based on fieldwork done by conflict armament research. Second, the report examines the systemic failures in multinational efforts, multilateral efforts to prevent precisely these kinds of technological components from reaching the heavily sanctioned missile and UAV manufacturers in Russia, as well as Iran and North Korea. To prevent these kinds of components from being used in the future, the report proposes a new framework for thinking about strengthening end-use controls in particular. So we have the pleasure of having the report authors with us today to talk us through their findings. Representing the contribution by Conflict Armament Research, we have its head of research, Rob Hunter Perkins. He has been with CAR since 2018 and established its research unit in 2020, serving also as editor-in-chief for the organization. Rob has an extensive background working for several NGOs on arms control and humanitarian disarmament. Our second author and speaker is David Hayes, who is the director of David Hayes Export Controls, an independent consultancy specializing in export controls and sanctions. He also serves as director of UK affairs at the Trade Compliance Group. David has headed compliance for large companies and held senior roles at the UK Export Control Organization in government. He's also a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society and a founding chair of the Export Group for Aerospace and Defense. So welcome, David and Rob. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us today. We will proceed as follows. First, we will hear presentations from the authors of around 10 minutes each. And already in that time, if you have questions, please feel free to write them in the chat at any point using the Q&A feature highlighted on the slide here. And if there's a particular author you would like to direct your question to, please indicate that as well. And then we will conclude timely at the top of the hour. And with that, Rob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Much appreciated. I'm just going to share some slides. If you can confirm that they have been sharing correctly, that'd be great, and I can get started.
Looks good.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us in this conversation, and very glad to have been invited not only to brief and to represent CAR in this event, but for CAR to have been invited to work together with the Institute and with David on this report. It's an area that we've been looking at in great detail for many years now. Our field investigators have been operational in Ukraine, working with national partners there since 2018 to inspect material recovered in the conflict. So we really value the Missile Dialogue Initiative as a platform to bring our battlefield evidence to try and help inform some of the policy debates that are so pressing at the moment. For those unfamiliar with our work, CAR is an independent investigative organization that specializes in documenting and tracing material that has been diverted to conflict zones. We work across a wide spectrum of material, from small arms and light weapons to commercial precursors used in the production of IEDs. And as an organization, our mission is to build verified evidence on patterns of illicit weapon procurement and to inform the development of multilateral policy and control frameworks by bringing that evidence to support specific operational decision-making and those discussions in multilateral fora. Founded in 2011, our field teams have been on the ground in over 30 countries across conflict hotspots in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. This background slide shows a sped up video of a field team at work. They are effective and efficient, but they're maybe not quite as fast as this. The data we report on is exclusively that's been documented by our trained field staff in situ after it's been recovered by our local defence and security force partners. So I think it's an important note for what I'm about to go in to describe and what is included in the report is that the insights I present from our work are derived from this very specific and granular data set that we ourselves collect and isn't meant to be intended as an overall baseline of the conflict as a whole. But how we work is that very much through that on-the-ground philosophy and in-field documentation. And markings and photos are entered into our iTrace database platform. And then we have tracing specialists and research investigators who work to reconstruct the supply chain as far as possible for those diverted items. And that includes, where appropriate and possible, through formal cooperation with government and industry partners. And for the scope of this report, we look specifically at what might be deemed advanced conventional weapon systems that were used in Ukraine that our field teams have encountered. And that includes 13 different models of ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as one-way attack and other UAVs. Since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, our teams have taken apart more than 220 Russian, Iranian, and North Korean weapon systems and documented more than 12,000 components inside. And I'm going to talk today about three kind of broad areas of key findings that are detailed in this report. I'll only have time for a bit of a top-tier overview of each. So I do welcome questions, as Alexander was saying at the start, on any of these related issues to do with our work. The first of these findings is that our field data shows that Russian, Iranian, and North Korean weapon systems are all heavily reliant on foreign-made technology. This is a much discussed observation, and it's one that we ourselves first reported on just a few months after the full-scale invasion, and it's something that our dispatches from the field are repeatedly showing across a range of material. And pictured here are three different systems that we focus on in the paper that exhibit this phenomenon. There's a Russian KH-69 cruise missile in the top left, an Iranian Shahed 136 UAV at the bottom, and a North Korean KN-23 or 24 ballistic missile in the right corner. And as our investigations have deepened both in Ukraine and globally, we have seen two maturations of this general observation. The first is that this reliance is consistent across all conventional systems, although there is significant variance between them. We've seen a particularly high volume of foreign components in some of the systems that are particularly central to the conflict in Ukraine. The report details, for example, an analysis of nearly 2,000 components that we recovered in the Shahed 136 pattern UAVs. And within those 2,000 components, we're only able to identify 15 of those as having been produced in either Iran or Russia. And our surmise from that is that because these systems are used in such large numbers in the conflict, it's necessary for both Russia and Iran to establish reliable procurement networks to sustain access to these microelectronics. So this also presents, on the converse side, potential choke points for regulators seeking to limit access to such capabilities. The second key observation is that through sustained field monitoring, we're beginning to understand the effect of restrictive measures on the issue of component accessibility. So in the report, we look in quite some detail at the components from a single recovered KH-69 air-launched cruise missile that we documented in August of last year. And in total, in that missile, we documented, I think, just under 800 components. And our assessment is that about half of those are foreign made. But what's notable, and what I hope is apparent from this graphic here, is that the overall proportion of domestic Russian-produced components versus foreign components in this particular system increased over time. And most starkly, it changed after the 2022 invasion and the subsequent introduction of sanctions. As you can see in the kind of line graph, there is a bit of a general breakdown where in the dark blue, we see the foreign produced components, and prior to and including 2022 itself, there was a fairly large proportion of foreign produced items. And that shifts so that by 2023 and 2024, more than 90% of the components with a 2023 date mark were produced in Russia. The KH-69 is itself a relatively contemporary weapon system. It was first introduced and entered into service just a couple of years ago. And this specific weapon that we documented in August of 2024, we believe, based on markings on the missile, was produced just a matter of months earlier before that time. And as we continue to look at these systems, we can begin to understand a bit more about whether there are specific components that continue to be accessed after relevant restrictive measures were introduced, or whether it's the case that potential pre-invasion stockpiling efforts are beginning to be reduced by the demands of the conflict dynamic. The second key area is related to the observation that many of the components that we document in these systems are multi-purpose, commercially available and widely available on the open market. To an extent, export control regimes have treated these small electronics as fairly comparatively low risk and non-sensitive technologies, but our field evidence is conclusively and repeatedly showing how central they are to the development of UAVs and missiles. And because they have their products designed with many different purposes and uses, having the proper knowledge of the potential military end use of these items is critical in a lot of cases to triggering relevant control measures. And that's where our information loop as an organization is intended to kick in. What we're trying to do is help close any gaps in like deniability or plausible deniability or lack of knowledge and awareness of risks that may have previously been overlooked, misunderstood, or just ignored or not accepted. And our tracing specialists have built strong relationships with many of the companies whose products have been diverted, and we work with them to provide alerts that feed future pre-export due diligence risk assessments. And there's initiatives that have sprung up in recent years to help support such efforts, and one of these is the Common High Priority List. And I don't want to speak for you, David, but I imagine you might touch on that in your remarks as well. And this is something that was introduced and was updated, I think, most recently in February last year. And it consists of a kind of 4-tier listing of, I think, 50 tariff items, tariff lines for goods used in Russian weapon development. And in the report, we looked at the extent to which the CHPL could be considered relevant and applicable to what is actually contained in these weapon systems. And we looked at some example systems in our data, those 3 that I've already highlighted. And broadly, we found that not only is the CHPL applicable to not just Russian systems, as it was designed to address, but also to Iranian and North Korean ones. But according to our own initial assessment, many of them are top-tier items. And that includes a quarter of all the foreign-made components in the Shahed 136 UAV that we analyzed, and as many as 40% of those in the KH-69 missile. This is something that we want to make clear as a preliminary assessment by our analysts, but it's something we're looking to refine and extend across our data in future. But what it helps show is that the CHPL is both effective as a tool to focus regulatory attention, and that it clearly highlights that some items that may have been viewed in some ways as relatively low strategic concern are in fact critical to the development of highly advanced weapon systems. Finally and briefly, I'll touch on our evolving understanding of how Russia, Iran, and North Korea seek to access this material, bearing in mind that all 3 face considerable and differential restrictive measures. Broadly speaking, all 3 countries take advantage of the general complexity of global and distributor-centric supply chains for this material, and use third-party intermediaries to purchase necessary components. In a lot of the cases we look at, these intermediaries don't have a direct link to central authorities, but are working just in markets where jurisdictions where restrictive measures are absent or lacking. And in the macro, what we've seen is a general shift in procurement of these technologies to countries that sit outside the Global Export Control Coalition, which is an informal grouping of 39 countries, including most of the major Western exporters like the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, Japan. These are all members of the GECC. But we've seen that technology that was once procured directly from those countries or through intermediaries based in those countries are now shifting to East Asian markets, and particularly to distributors and retailers in China and Hong Kong. And I, again, should say that we've never documented evidence that that's being done with the knowledge or support of authorities in those countries. It rather, in our view at least, reflects China's preeminence across the supply chain for microelectronics. But I can end my presentation on this example, which is drawn from an investigation we carried out into the company that's responsible for producing satellite navigation systems used in several different Russian missile systems. And that company used to purchase components for these systems from a European subsidiary. And that practice halted after February 2022, even before the company in question itself was sanctioned. The company producing the SN99 was sanctioned. The sales stopped from the EU subsidiary, and instead the company then was able to purchase the same material from a different private company based in China. And this graphic shows a general shift in imports by that company, not just for the material used for the SN99 system, but in general in trade data. And it shows a very mixed picture and a real balance between different regions in 2020. And then by 2024, it's entirely procurement from China and Hong Kong-based companies last year. And to wrap up, I'd just like to stress that for us, this shows the importance of sustained and long-term field documentation to track these dynamics. They're complicated, they're evolving, and license controls for components like these are not typically triggered unless it's known that the component has a potential military end use. So there's a role for monitoring and investigative organizations in providing good data to states and industry to make such decisions. And in the cases we've investigated, where there's been a lack of awareness or clarity of exactly how a product might be used in advance. So the question really is like, how do states, how do industry, and how do control frameworks themselves react to these developments? And I think that might be an appropriate note to hand over to David. And I'd just like to end by thanking you again for inviting us today, and thanking my team for their work to this contribution, as I'm here to reflect their expertise. So yeah, I hope I've done a good job of doing so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. I do think you've done a really excellent job at giving us a high-level overview of some of the great research that is in the report, and I strongly encourage audience members to download the report because there's a lot of juicy technical detail in there. We'll now hear from David about why it's been hard to keep foreign components from being used for missiles and UAVs in the Russian war. Go ahead, David.
Thanks, Alex. I'd like to echo Rob's comments and just say thank you to the Institute for the opportunity to participate in the paper and in this webinar, and indeed to thank Rob and Carr for their putting all the meat on the bones. And I can now talk about the bit that comes after that, which is what we can attempt to do from an export control and broader compliance perspective in order to manage this situation. People may be familiar with the structure of the regimes. Some of the audience, some may not. So please bear with me on this. I think it's important to look at a bit of the background to the regimes. That the multilateral regimes are generally regarded as being the Wassenaar Arrangement, the Missile Technology Control Regime, the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Of those three, Russia is a member. Although Russia is not a member of the remaining regime, the Australia Group, it is a signatory to the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention that underpin the Australia Group. And I think in that context, it's important to bear in mind that export controls are not about preventing a conflict. They are about reducing the risk of conflicts, but they are not targeted on a specific conflict. Broadly speaking, that's more a role of sanctions. However, export controls do have a role to play, and the question that's taxing a lot of people all over the world at the moment is, what exactly is that role? What should it be? And the limitation that we come up against in relation to the multilateral regimes is that depending on the rules of the regime concerned, technical scope changes of the regime typically require unanimity or consensus. Russia is a member of three of those regimes, so consensus is at best unlikely. And it's also important to bear in mind that the main regimes that we're talking about in the context of the Ukraine conflict and missiles and UAVs are Wassenaar and the Missile Technology Control Regime. Neither of those is a treaty, and neither of those imposes legally binding obligations on the members. And as I said at the beginning, in a very practical sense, the multilateral regimes are not focused on a single conflict. And although a single conflict, as is the case with Ukraine, may highlight risks that hadn't really been appreciated in the broader context, when it comes to making changes to the technical scope of those regimes, that's not working at the moment. That part of the system is broken for obvious reasons. So the knock-on effect of that is that we are forced to make those changes outside the scope of the multilateral regimes, and we end up with this coalition of the willing, the group of countries to which Rob referred, who are like-minded countries. Hence, we come up with the common high priority list as an example of what can be done. 30 countries that subscribe to the common high priority list. It's comparable to the 35 in the MTCR. In fact, all 30 members are also members of the MTCR. So it's broader in product scope, but it's even narrower in its geographical applicability than the MTCR itself is. Diversion doesn't mind whether it's diverting from a multilateral regime or a voluntary regime like the common high priority list. The incentives for diversion, the profits to be made, the political will to divert are the same, essentially, regardless of whether we're talking about a multilateral regime and or a collaborative, totally voluntary regime like the CHPL. I think the thing to bear in mind is that we're looking at a sort of small population in global terms of Western countries from whom these components are typically being sourced, unless and until they can be diverted outside of that fence, if you will. And the means of diversion are going to be well known to a lot of you. But a typical one is establishing front companies within a low friction zone for export. So the increasing use of these low cost drones using what are, as Rob said, very simple, I would say, if not crude components, things that we wouldn't control typically under multilateral regimes, simply because meaningful control of them would be impossible to achieve, and it would impose an immense burden on regulators for little or no reward. The typical way to approach this, and it's already the approach for unlisted items in the UK and EU, is via end-use controls. And it's interesting to compare the American end-use controls under Part 744 of the EAR with the end-use controls in the UK and EU. Because the American controls are against a much broader group of countries than the UK or EU controls, and they also extend to both listed and non-listed items, whereas UK and EU controls and use controls apply only to unlisted items. And you can argue that, okay, end-use controls, if you need a license, are considered in the licensing process. And if there are end-use concerns, then surely you're not going to get a license. However, it's not quite that simple. When you look at end-use controls, it can be very, very difficult for an individual exporter, particularly small to medium enterprises, to do a rigorous assessment of end-use controls. If everyone goes to the government and carries out end-use checks, the system falls over for lack of capacity. If you're using an OGEL to export to the EU, for example, yes, in theory, you shouldn't be doing that if you know that there's an end-use control risk. But you can't carry out an end-user check on an EU country because the Export Control Joint Unit in the UK won't carry out such checks because they don't believe that there is sufficient risk, presumably, in those countries in order to be prepared to carry out checks at the request of exporters. That does not mean that intelligence doesn't exist to say that there is actually a risk in those countries. And if the end use control were to be more broadly focused and therefore achieve a higher level of visibility, not just with exporters, but also with regulators themselves, it may result in a better picture of what's going on, which in turn would inform what CAR are doing and the efforts to stem these diversionary exports that are causing such a problem. And the means to do that, from a UK point of view, it's simply having the political will to change the domestic regulations. And yes, in some cases, if we change those regulations and it becomes known that we are imposing them against some near neighbours, in practice, it may upset a few people. That's not a compliance decision. That's a political decision. Is that level of upset, diplomatically, a price that we are prepared to pay in order to collectively achieve the goal that presumably both parties to that upset share of preventing this proliferation that's currently going on? The EU, for historical reasons, is likely to be more of a problem in terms of extending its controls, particularly in relation to China, as I say, for historical reasons. And that's why I think there is scope within the end use control mechanism to increase the effectiveness of that mechanism in the context of what is currently going on in the Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for the explanation of why this is a difficult problem, but also offering some creative solutions to help us get our head around it. I've got a good provocative first question, which is, can't Russia just switch to components made in China? Or are there specific technologies that they can only get from the West? Would either of you like to tackle that? Go ahead, Rob.
Thank you, Alexander. It is a good question, and it's something we're actively monitoring, and it's something I think we're seeing to an extent already in our field work. What we're doing again with like sustained in-field documentation work is to try and assess whether there are switches in components that are happening in real time, and whether that switch is from markets that are in China or any other country that sits outside the GECC. There are cases where there are specific technologies that have changed, exactly as the questioner described. And there are others that, as far as we can tell, there are specific technologies that have not changed and that there isn't a market alternative to outside of very specific providers. I'm not intending to be overly cryptic on the technical specifics of that, but this is something I've discussed with our field investigative teams, and I don't have specific examples to share to illustrate either comparator. But the other point, I think a general one to make that's valid, is that there's a difference between items that are made by Chinese companies or items that are made in GCC countries that are sold into China through open diffuse markets and supply chains. So it's differentiating and separating out production in these contexts as opposed to sourcing through these contexts. They're two very different things. It could be tackled very differently. And this is what we're kind of currently actively looking to determine.
David, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't think so. Thank you. Thanks, Alex.
Very good. The next question might be better aimed at you. And we have an attendee asking, how difficult is it for manufacturers to be aware of the military end use where intermediaries are involved? Are they usually able to see the ultimate recipient of their product or only the intermediary? For end use controls, would we aim for manufacturers to refrain from using intermediaries that are known to send onwards to Russian military-linked entities?
It's a very good question. For commercial reasons, it's quite often the case that the supplier can't see beyond the distributor, because the distributor is doing the sourcing for the customer, And commercially, they don't want to be cut out of the middle and have the supplier going directly to their customer, if you will. However, it is good practice for the exporter to ask who the ultimate end user is, but they don't always get that information. And if they do get it, it is not necessarily always accurate. So sometimes it comes down to the level of due diligence that a company is exercising. Things like a specific shopping list coming in from 3 different distributors, and one of the distributors you're already concerned about because of things that you're becoming aware of, and you've got a pretty good impression of where that shopping list is coming from. And again, it comes down to what you might call the compliance posture of the exporting company. Does the commercial need to make a profit override the ethical consideration of whether or not to make an export, when you can argue in the current end use control, from a UK and an EU point of view, it only kicks in when the exporter has been informed by government or knows that there is a military end use. If they can show that they've done sufficient due diligence, whatever that might be, then there's not a problem from their point of view in making the export, which is why HMRC in the UK are quite strong when they stop things for end use concerns, particularly in relation to Russia, about how thoroughly they will examine due diligence should the exporter decide to proceed with the export, which usually has the practical effect of putting the exporter off continuing with the export. Thank you.
Rob, I believe you had something to add there.
Oh, sort of to add, and also to echo everything that David just said, I think is a very thorough answer to that question. The issue of the extent to which manufacturers or anyone higher up in the supply chain can have full visibility of the downstream transactions. The simple answer is that they can't. And I'd echo very much what David said, that in most cases there isn't that visibility provided to a single actor in the supply chain, unless there is like very stringent pre-export measures taken where there's like a very high risk of diversion or misuse and the goods are considered very sensitive. We've investigated cases where manufacturers have chosen to kind of introduce end user controls before transaction that they're not required to do by law in their country, but they considered it a sensible step. And even at that level, I think that ensured kind of a visibility down through 3 or 4 sales down the supply chain, but still didn't prevent the item. The reason we became aware of it was because it still got diverted through commercial resale. So there's not really a way in which a single actor can do that all the way through. And this is something we've also grappled with just as a kind of methodological question as an organization. Speaking to a lot of these actors, these, as I mentioned before, are quite diffuse supply chains, but there is a view that as a result of that, there's nothing that can be done at all. What we've been able to do is work with the different component producers and industry partners to overlay their responses and essentially triangulate and target or detect kind of common bottlenecks that might exist. And these bottlenecks might just be large players who are active across multiple different component supply chains. And that is definitely the case. There's situations where hundreds of different manufacturers, sometimes small, sometimes big, their products that are potentially quite unrelated are all converging at the same distributor level, which gives them a little bit more power of visibility, being a bit further down the supply chain, and a bit more of and also an incentive to act and try and take measures themselves. It also allows us to kind of target if there is a particular actor that's popping up across what might be, again, otherwise unrelated component supply chains. It's not something that manufacturers can do at their end, but it's something that we at CAR have seen that this kind of tangled morass of supply chains actually converge on very specific entities. And that's the information that I think is valuable for us to share back up. The other point that I think maybe is the only thing that wasn't covered before is the kind of responsibility of downstream actors to also try and tackle diversion of components. Often record keeping, serial number tracking, and things like that. That's very well done at the manufacturer level and exporter level, and there are often practices particularly among big suppliers to do so. And then as you go further down the retailer, as we try to trace items at the lower level, there's often not that same due diligence or preemptive measures being taken. So I think there's a lot less focus on those actors in the international debate at the moment. A lot of it is on the manufacturers. They're the names of the brands on the components. They're the ones whose names get in the media. But there's a kind of big group of actors as well that I think have a proactive and productive role to play.
Thank you. We have two questions that I'll pose to Rob, I believe, because they're directed at you. And these are about the strategic adaptation between efforts at control and evading those control. So the first question asks, have you seen any efforts on Russia's part to avoid sanctions? Are they creating shell companies and so forth? And there's another question from your cases on traceability. Are the alternative supply routes set up preemptively, or are they a reactive shift? So how much movement do we see in these procurement tactics?
Yeah, both fantastic questions. Appreciate them. The former one around shell companies. Yes, we've detailed in the report instances, the quite high profile instances where there's been an effort to create knowingly, deliberately create front and shell companies. But actually, I would say that, and I don't want to put a proportion on it, but the majority of the cases we look at, it's not done through preconceived front companies. It's just carried out through commercial actors who are kind of operating, again, like at the fringes or outside of existing controls. So most of the times that we've investigated these third-party intermediaries post-invasion, they're not those that have been that we've been able to find like any kind of like coordinated link. But we have in other investigations in the past seen that practice. So I also wouldn't want to rule it out in cases that we're actively investigating that eventuality might exist. I think the one I can speak to as well is the reactive or preemptive question. Again, I think I'd address it as a generality rather than specifically. But speaking generally, my view of it is reactive, largely, if not entirely, reactive. These are responses to restrictions. There's a drying up of existing supply chains that are, in most cases, I think, prompted not by a sanction of the recipient entity in Russia or Iran or wherever, but a control on the actual transfer of the component itself. The preference, as far as I can see, is for entities to try and resource the same material once they found something that works and meets certain testing and assurance standards. You try and seek that material, that component, that specific brand from a different source rather than change to a different source as a preferential option. So the moves that we see, I think, are largely a reaction to control efforts and to practices at the export side.
Terrific, thank you. We have a really interesting question here. To what extent are the Russians able to use 3D printing for the components that they need? Would either of you have a take on that?
Not a strong take. I'm not aware of components themselves that are 3D printed in the weapon systems we've documented. We've seen some evidence of things like 3D printed release mechanisms on UAVs, but I'm speaking from memory here. These are largely those that are by less resourced non-state actors, not by resource capable states. I don't think that's something we've seen in our data. No.
I think from an export control point of view, it's an interesting question because 3D printing of a component, of course, only requires the export of a computer file. So there's nothing ever going through customs anywhere, and give a man a fish and feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and feed him for life. They don't have to, once they've got the ability to manufacture the component themselves, they don't need to be constantly trying to get things through the pipeline physically, and exporting the necessary computer file. The only way there's any chance of combating that is by signals intelligence. And if we're talking low-level components, my inclination is to think that there will be higher priorities.
Thank you. We'll switch tone a little bit to a self-described provocative question. Components made in country X being found in Russian drones makes for good headlines, but isn't trying to control these components, many of which are extremely widely available, a losing battle. Wouldn't the more worthwhile approach be to leverage the widespread availability of cheap components for new counter-UAV solutions? Any reactions?
I can kick off. I can't really speak, I think, to the latter part of the hypothesis. I suspect it's not an either-or question, and that there are lots of efforts to create UAV countermeasures. But I would strongly rebut the question that it's the idea that it is entirely a losing battle. It is obviously a tricky one. I'm not suggesting that it's a simple and easy control framework to implement, but we've seen lots of instances where there have been successes in responding to this question on a kind of specific case-by-case basis, where there have been detection and enforcement measures introduced by states to prevent specific individuals, break up networks, break up cells that are trying to divert this material. We've seen regulatory actions introduced and measures taken by industry to like change up the game of their due diligence. It's not a case. I think sometimes I hear in this policy debate a sense of kind of fatalism. That I think that's what the question does speak towards. Like that is, I think, quite a widespread view. The kind of the cat's out of the bag phenomenon, I think, for this technology is, I think, something that can be pushed back against. I think you can't completely eliminate the prospect and risk of this technology proliferating both to state and non-state actors alike. What can, and I think can effectively be demonstrated, is that you can limit the ability and freedom and capability with which these actors can acquire this technology, make it harder for them, raise the costs, and you know there is still plenty of time, if you like, to do that work. The genie's not out of the bottle in that regard. Being able to, crucially though, you need to understand what it is that's actually being at risk of diversion there and how it gets there to be able to kind of implement effective strategies. And that works both like nationally and individually, but also kind of multilaterally. And I think that's where the work still needs to be done. So.
Yeah, I think it is an interesting question, and I think it's also important to bear in mind that a counter UAV is still a UAV, and that there are issues regarding the potential for controls that are intended to capture offensive UAVs being equally applicable to the defensive solutions of UAVs that are intended to counter UAVs. But from a practical point of view, the components being found in Russian drones have by definition gone outside the countries where they were permitted to go. And if we take Ukraine as an example, Ukraine is not an embargoed country. If these, and it doesn't have many sanctioned entities, if any, the components that were being sent to the Ukraine, if that's what we're talking about, or intended to be sent to the Ukraine, wouldn't be restricted anyway because they don't require licenses. So yes, we could use unrestricted components in manufacturing counter UAV solutions like interceptor UAVs, but I don't think the controls are having that much of an impact on that effort anyway.
Thank you both. The next audience question says, the commercial components that can be placed in weapons are so easily accessible. Sounds like a problem for proliferation to non-state actors. Are states even equipped to start addressing this?
I can certainly jump in on this, and I'm sorry to jump in ahead of David if you were about to put your hand up as well. I worked on this topic with the United Nations Office on Counterterrorism last year to try and map some of and assess kind of the state of readiness and the extent of the issue that already exists. I mean, drone use, UAV use by non-state actors and armed groups is a real phenomenon and concern, and actively being addressed, but I think is a big challenge as well. And I think these two areas are very much interlinked when you look at acquisition and supply chains, because I think there's a lot of work being done on countering deployment of UAVs by non-state armed groups, and that includes like technical countermeasures. But I think the commonality is on modeling and preventing the supply chains that these groups are actively using. So we've been working, on this for over a decade in some contexts. We documented Islamic State's use of drones in Iraq and Syria back in 2016 when they were weaponizing commercial quadcopters. And to an extent, for a lot of groups, the dynamic hasn't changed dramatically since then. There is still that kind of quite basic, quite crude, I think, to use the term you used earlier, David, I think is quite a fair one. Fairly kind of crude weaponization structural functionality that goes on. And what you need to look at is how to deprive if you can't deprive the actual use of the UAV, you can certainly deprive the use of the explosive or kinetic materials. There's two entry points there to tackle. There are a few more well-resourced and supported non-state armed groups who have far more capable UAVs, and the other risk is that there is a knowledge proliferation that grows rapidly in the short and long term. And yeah, I think the state of readiness is mixed, let's say. Nationally mixed, but internationally, I think is a huge area of work to tackle. And there's not even a one particular framework or forum for these discussions to be held in. And I think that's probably like one of the areas to look at is exactly like how and where should those conversations be had, because there's so many different dimensions to the UAV threat or risk, speaking of like non-state actors use, that I think it's easy for one big area to get overlooked, and the pictures need to be joined up together.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is that it is a classic measure countermeasure struggle that's going on, and it will typically follow the model of those measure countermeasure struggles that have gone on over the years. The capability is of concern. What the measures are to control the capability when it becomes so prolific is questionable. Can we protect everything all the time? No. And will there come a point where we have to focus protection on those areas of critical national infrastructure that are considered to merit higher levels of protection, and leave some places unprotected as they are not of sufficient importance to merit a level of protection? Probably yes, because that's typically what we've done in relation to previous threats like terrorist attacks. You can't protect everywhere all the time. It's the way life is, unfortunately.
The next question is directed to David. How do you assess the UK and other countries' awareness raising effort among manufacturers? Is this something that can be streamlined? And is there anything you have seen in one country that works well and could be adopted elsewhere?
Sorry, my unmute doesn't work there. I think the awareness raising that's going on is it's a bit like the coalition of the willing that's trying to apply the common high priority list. Those who are aware of it tend to be in the population of companies that were aware of export controls before and were trying to comply. From a UK point of view, looking at export controls, the effort of the ECJU when it comes to awareness raising and compliance, a lot of that effort is directed at monitoring companies that are using open export licenses for the quality of their use of open export licenses. That's not a criticism of ECJU, that's a machinery of government question. ECJU is responsible for the quality of use of open licenses. Exporting without a license at all is a governmental responsibility of HMRC in terms of machinery of government. Raising awareness among those who are already aware achieves nothing. And it's the sort of companies who are out there receiving what in the UK are called notices to exporters or other governmental updates. It's like subscribers to a magazine are aware of what's in the magazine, assuming that they bothered to read the magazine. People who don't subscribe to a magazine may not even be aware of the magazine, much less what is in it. And I think the real challenge is how you gain the attention of companies, particularly in the distributor role, who don't see themselves as exporters of things that matter, things that have a strategic importance. We sell bits, is their mindset. They can be used for all sorts. How the hell do we know what they're used for is a typical response. And I think that is a real challenge, getting them to appreciate that what they are doing is within the scope of these controls, potentially. It does matter to them, and they should be paying attention. And in my experience, the most effective way to get companies to pay attention to this sort of thing is by affecting their bottom line. There has to be a business case in order for a company to react. Because the first question, and it's not a criticism again, it's the way life works. Any responsible finance director in a company is going to say, why should we do this? What's the benefit part of the cost benefit analysis? If there isn't one, where's the business case to do anything? If there isn't a business case, it's not going to happen, is my honest opinion.
We have interest from the audience in the MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime, and there's a specific question. From what the speakers have said, it sounds as though the primary concern is UAV components for simpler UAVs. Is your assessment that the MTCR has been largely effective in its goal, i.e. preventing the proliferation of larger, longer range missiles and UAVs?
I'll be very brief on this because I think David may be a better place to speak to the MTCR. I'm not an expert in the MTCR itself. We did a very preliminary analysis. We started to try and look ourselves at whether some of these components fell under the control framework of it, and we were coming to the view that they weren't really effectively captured. So I think that question about how effective it is an interesting one to assess with more research and more dedicated focus. But I think the risk of proliferation of these UAVs, whether it's the MTCR or other, there needs to be kind of like focused consideration on the proliferation of UAVs, both to state and non-state actors. And I think there needs to be a focused concern under a dedicated framework, whether that's the MTC or others, I'm not sure.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I share that view. I think when you look at the research, admittedly, it's a small population of components and a small population of missiles that are covered in this article. And the representation, if you will, of components that will be captured by the MTCR is very, very low. Is that an argument across the board? Can you extrapolate that to a larger population of things? Without the data to support it, it's difficult to say. Gut feel, MTCR at what it is designed to do is largely speaking being effective. Will it continue to be so when you consider that we've got some very capable nations in manufacturing large-scale MTCR systems up to and including Category 1 systems who are finding themselves somewhat isolated in the world. I think there are going to be two sides to the MTCR argument, and it's very difficult then, from, let's call it, our side of the fence, to paint ourselves as being squeaky clean when we've got arguments coming from the US that what was previously regarded as an MTCR Category 1 system should not be regarded as a Category 1 system if its airspeed doesn't exceed 800 kilometers an hour. While ever commercial imperatives to increase sales of systems override the concerns of the proliferation of those systems, this sort of thing will happen. That is not a function of the compliance system itself. It's not a function of MTCR. It's a way MTCR is interpreted and applied by members of MTCR. And it's not only the US that have been criticised for such things over the lifetime of MTCR. And it's important to bear in mind one of the things that I said at the beginning: MTCR is not a treaty, and the requirements of MTCR are not legally binding, even on its members. Thank you.
Go ahead, Rob.
Sorry, David's answer, as expected, was thorough, but it's also prompted a thought in my mind that I think maybe can add to this conversation, because it's not, again, MTCR specific, but it's more broad. But I think what we're seeing is kind of the challenges and limitations of the list-based approach to controlling material, both in the MTCR and in other frameworks. If you list something, but there's two ways in which a lot of these components are controlled. One is kind of based on the technical parameters and whether they fall under a list or not. And then the other is these kind of more kind of general catch-all clauses, for lack of a better term, or equivalent. And these apply to kind of exports to specific contexts and situations where there's knowledge of the use in embargoed contexts and other kind of quite broad categories. So I think there is a kind of challenge here, a fundamental one, in the kind of listing. You can't list everything ad infinitum under the sun. And if you list up to a certain technical specification, you might have to change that and change it. And as David said, mechanically, that's incredibly difficult in a consensus-based environment as well. You're not going to achieve a lot of progress through that approach only. So there needs to be quite a balanced approach to consideration of what items need to be added or how lists need to be amended in these fora. The other approach is this catch-all one, which is a risk-based approach. Fundamentally, it's about understanding how your product might be used, and that is all about knowledge, information, and data. So I've seen questions as well, and I know we won't have time to address all of them, about the reasonable burden of due diligence that companies should expect, but that is very much dependent on the product. And I love David's analogy of the magazine reader and outreach to entities that already know it. I think it's very apt. And I think we've seen cases where there are entities that we've reached out to who had no familiarity of the issue or the misuse of their products. And I think that whole picture is changing and changed because of the public nature and the high profile nature of this challenge in the last few years. So the onus on a risk-based approach that needs to be case specific, I think, is the direction that I think needs to be added into this debate. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
For our, unfortunately, last question, Rob, we have a question directed at you. Has CAR continued to document Russian missiles in Ukraine in recent months? And specifically, are North Korean missiles still being used by Russia?
We're actively documenting stuff. I'm not sure literally as we speak, but very contemporarily, yes. Our field teams are operative in Ukraine fairly regularly. I think we've documented in total 10 North Korean missiles. The last one of these was at the beginning of the year, but I think the crucial underlying point to that is about our data, as I mentioned at the start, is a bit of a snapshot based on access that we negotiate with and receive through our partners. It's not a fundamental baseline. So the fact that we haven't documented something recently doesn't mean it's not being used. So I don't think our data can be used to frame an issue that way. But we are actively monitoring North Korean material use in Ukraine, and that's very much a focus of our ongoing operations. And I would only invite the audience to stay tuned to our future outputting in the next few months and in the future. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you, David, both for your time with us today and the excellent research that you contributed. I strongly encourage the audience to read the report, and maybe if you see any other items of interest in the MDI research series, I strongly recommend those as well. And with that, the time is up here. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.